Today we're going to talk about, pretty much ends the section on traits. And we're going to talk today about the practical utility of traits, essentially. It's always nice if you're doing psychological research to have a hard target. You know, it turns out to be relatively uncommon among psychological researchers to actually try to predict something. I mean, if you use a regression equation, which is what most of the stats that you'd use if you were doing psychology research are based on, the purpose of the experiment or the research, hypothetically, is the derivation of a regression equation that might enable you to predict something useful in the future. But in psychology, a lot of that has devolved into sort of descriptive work, showing that two groups differ on some trait or some feature, but the actual utility of knowing that is not, it's not self-evident. It's partly why I got interested in prediction, in performance prediction, because you can measure performance and it actually matters. So that would be performance creatively, say, or academically, or if you're working in an industrial area, so just say as a factory worker or in a job that can be reduced to essentially an algorithm. So if you're in a job that can be reduced to an algorithm, once you learn it, you know how to do it. So those are simpler jobs. And then performance in complex jobs as well. Performance as an entrepreneur, those are all, in some sense, real-world phenomena, although, of course, you still have a measurement problem, right? So if you're trying to measure, for example, how successful middle managers are in a corporation, it's not that easy to specify because, you know, if you're measuring the performance of salesmen, you can see how much they sold, and then you have a performance measure that's basically de facto. But if you're trying to measure the performance of managers, say, say in an institution like the University of Toronto, or even in a profit-making institution, their connection with outside marketplace is not, it's not immediately obvious. So then you might ask, well, how in the world could you assess their performance? And the way it's generally done is, well, you can have them rate themselves. That has obvious problems, but you know, it's not without validity, completely without validity. You could have their managers rate them. That assumes that their managers know what they're doing and that they're accurate judges of their actual quality of performance. You can have their peers rate them, and you can have the people that are working for them rate them. And it turns out that if you do that on a fairly regular basis, you know, say once every quarter or once every 6 months or something like that, and you use a standardized questionnaire that you can so that you can do a quantitative analysis, that you can get pretty reliable indicators of performance. Now, the problem, of course, is just because your manager or the people that are working for you think you're doing a good job, does that mean that the job you're doing is adding anything to the actual productivity of the company? And the answer to that is, you don't know. So I think to some degree that's why large companies tend to be somewhat unstable, is once they get large enough, there's a lot of inside to them. It's not attached to the market in any way, and so people can be working very hard, but and therefore productive from the perspective of actual, you know, labor input, but whether or not that actually is producing a profit or producing the kind of consequence that you'd want it to produce so that the company can keep going, that's a completely different problem. So even when you're trying to predict performance, which is a fairly, as I said, a fairly real-world phenomena, you still have the problem of how it is that you measure performance. So for example, you guys are being graded all the time, and you might ask yourself, well, what's the utility of those grades? What do they accurately represent? Well, you know they're going to be used in situations where you're trying to enter higher education and the selection criteria are actually grades. You know, so if you want to go on to graduate school or to law school or to medicine or any of the professional schools, then whether or not you get good grades actually matters. But then the relationship between grades and, say, achievement outside of those specific places where grades are necessary, you might argue that that's less clear. One thing we do know about the grades at the University of Toronto is that their correlation with trait creativity is 0. And so, you know, you might hope that one of the things that you'd be assessed for while you're in university would have something to do with creativity, right? You're supposed to think originally and creatively and so on. But our research so far, when we've analyzed what's predicting grades at the U of T, it's all IQ and conscientiousness. So, and introverts do slightly better, but not a tremendous amount. That's probably because they're not out partying all the time. That would be my suspicion. But openness, apart from IQ, has no relationship whatsoever. And I think that's actually partly because it's not that easy. First of all, you're not going to get graded for being creative on a multiple choice test, right? Because the last thing you want to be on a multiple choice test is creative, right? So, and then with regards to an essay, well, the problem with writing a creative essay is in some sense you force the grader to come up with a scheme of grading that's sort of unique to you, right? Because you've done something original and new, and so it's not that easy for the person who's grading it. You're forcing them to step outside of their comfortable rubric. And of course that's a demand, and when your TAs are grading, for example, and they have 100 papers to grade, the probability that on average they're going to appreciate a clear, easy to read essay that does exactly what it was supposed to do is quite high, rather than something that's original and creative and that actually requires thought to understand. Now, you know, I don't know if that's actually the problem, although I suspect it could well be. But I do know that grades are not a good marker of creativity. So neither, you know, creative achievement per se, so that's actually creative products that you've produced in your life, neither that nor trait openness nor measures of creative thinking are associated with grades. So I would say that the data sort of indicate that grades might be a good marker of managerial and administrative ability, but they're unlikely to be a good marker of creative and entrepreneurial ability. So anyways, in any institution, you know, there's always a tension between the specific demands of the institution, which are kind of orderly and set, and then the requirement for creativity, which is a very difficult thing for an institution to deal with because institutions try to make things algorithmic so they can be predictable. So I think that tension is always there wherever you go in your life, and that's also probably why openness and conscientiousness are actually not correlated, right? Because they're responses to really different forms of environments.